Hey folks, I'm Happy. Out here in the woods, my best friends have fur and feathers. But today's tale happens in a different kind of wilderness, the concrete jungle of Manhattan. It's about a cold-hearted CEO, a struggling dad, and how a cheap bunch of bruised daisies managed to melt an empire of ice. Kindness sure blooms in the wildest places. Where are you tuning in from today? Let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories. The sky over Manhattan that Tuesday morning was the color of a bruised plum, heavy and weeping a relentless cold rain against the reinforced glass of the 60th floor. Down below, Fifth Avenue was nothing but a sluggish river of yellow cabs and black umbrellas, moving with the slow rhythm of a city that didn't want to wake up. But up here, in the stratosphere of corporate ambition, the weather was utterly irrelevant. Up here, perfection and efficiency were the only laws of physics that mattered. I am Wilder, the executive floor director of Lumiere. I am 52 years old, a man of quiet steps, silver-templed hair, and meticulously tailored but unassuming navy suits. I've survived 3 corporate mergers and 4 different CEOs, mostly by knowing exactly when to speak and, more importantly, when to fade quietly into the expensive beige wallpaper. My job is to ensure that the machinery of this executive floor hums without the slightest friction. But today, the friction was palpable, grinding against the gears of the company's very soul. I stood silently near the mahogany double doors of the corner office, observing Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, the CEO of our cosmetics and fashion empire, was a woman carved from glacial ice. She was 45, with immaculate ash blonde hair pulled back so tightly into a flawless chignon that it seemed to elevate her sharp, patrician cheekbones even higher. Today, she wore a tailored emerald green power suit that functioned less like clothing and more like bulletproof armor. Her personality, unforgiving, precise, and seemingly devoid of sentimentality, was not born, it was forged. Rumors whispered through the break rooms that she had crawled her way up from a squalid downtown loft, a struggling single mother who learned early on that the world only respects power and capital. She had locked away her vulnerabilities so deep that most of us wondered if she had swallowed the key. Right now, her pale blue eyes were fixed intensely on the glowing screens in front of her, drowning in a sea of demand gen campaign reports for YouTube. The autumn collection launch was imminent. Budgets needed locking, headlines needed optimizing, and she had zero tolerance for anything that did not directly translate to a return on investment. Curled up on a custom velvet ottoman in the corner of her office was Duchess, Eleanor's 6-year-old purebred Persian cat. Duchess was an animal of absurd pedigree and flawless grooming, her coat a thick cloud of pristine snow. She was notoriously aloof, possessing a temperament that perfectly mirrored her owner's. Duchess tolerated no unsolicited affection, having once drawn blood from a junior executive for daring to pet her without permission. But there was a darker presence looming over the day, one much more dangerous than a temperamental feline. Victor Thorne, our chief operating officer. I had seen him pacing the corridor earlier, a tall, imposing figure with slicked-back dark hair and the kind of bespoke, charcoal pinstripe suit that screamed Wall Street predator. Victor had a calculated smile that never quite reached his cold, obsidian eyes. His entire worldview was shaped during his ruthless years in private equity, a cutthroat environment that stripped him of any artistic empathy and taught him to view human beings merely as liabilities on a spreadsheet. Victor was currently pushing a massive, merciless restructuring plan. His proposal was simple and devastating. Fire the entire internal content production team, every lighting technician, every set designer, every loyal temporary worker, and outsource the operation to a dirt-cheap offshore agency to maximize profit margins. The final board meeting to decide the fate of these people was scheduled for 3 o'clock this afternoon. And worst of all, Victor currently had the upper hand. The board loved his projected numbers, completely blind to the artistic hemorrhage it would cause Lumiere. The heavy, sterile silence of Eleanor's office was suddenly broken by a timid knock. Sarah pushed the heavy glass door open. Sarah was Eleanor's executive assistant, a 24-year-old woman who always looked as though a stiff breeze might blow her over. She was tall, painfully thin, and had a habit of hiding her frame inside oversized, oatmeal-colored cardigans worn over modest dresses. Her hazel eyes were constantly darting, a nervous energy left over from a previous job working under a notoriously abusive fashion magazine editor. That traumatic experience had made her hyper-aware of shifting moods, turning her into a human barometer for executive rage. Yet, beneath her trembling hands, Sarah possessed a quiet, stubborn moral compass that often surprised me. Today, her hands were definitely trembling. In her arms, looking aggressively out of place in a room overflowing with imported red roses and pristine Phalaenopsis orchids from global partners, was a bouquet of white daisies. They were cheap. They were wrapped in layers of old, damp newspaper. Several of the petals were already bruised and browning at the edges, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the 60th floor. Duchess opened one icy blue eye, regarded Sarah and the damp flowers with absolute disdain, and promptly went back to sleep. "Miss Vance," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, echoing faintly against the marble floors. Eleanor did not look up. Her fingers continued their rapid, rhythmic assault on the keyboard. "What is it, Sarah? If it's the ad spend projections, put them on the right. If it's legal, put it on the left. I do not have time for frivolities today." It's a delivery, ma'am," Sarah stammered, holding the tragic little bundle of flowers closer to her chest, as if to protect them from the freezing temperature of the room. "Someone sent this for the executive office." Eleanor finally stopped typing. She slowly raised her head, her gaze shifting from the high-resolution monitor to the crushed daisies. Her jaw tightened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 5 degrees. "Throw it away, Sarah," Eleanor ordered, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion other than profound irritation. "You know perfectly well that I do not accept garbage from nameless individuals. We are running a sprint for the autumn collection launch. Do not bring trash into my office." Sarah swallowed hard. She looked down at the flowers, then back at her imposing boss. "But ma'am," she hesitated, her voice shaking but refusing to break entirely. "The courier said it was sent by Arthur Hayes. He's the temporary lighting technician, the one who stayed late to build the sets for our YouTube promotional videos last week." "I do not care," Eleanor replied, her tone carrying an absolute, unquestionable finality. She dismissed Sarah with a sharp, impatient flick of her manicured wrist and returned her eyes to the glaring light of the screen. "Throw it away, now." I watched from the threshold as Sarah's shoulders slumped. She let out a soft, defeated sigh and turned toward the door, carrying the rejected daisies. But Sarah, driven by that strange, quiet defiance of hers, stopped just short of the exit. With agonizing care, she slipped her slender fingers into the damp newspaper wrapping and extracted a tiny, crumpled piece of coarse cardboard. She walked back to the massive, tempered glass desk. Eleanor ignored her completely. Sarah gently placed the small card right on the edge of the glass, just within Eleanor's peripheral vision. "I will throw the flowers away, ma'am," Sarah said quietly, her hand lingering in the air over the card for a fraction of a second. "But you really should read this." Sarah turned and walked out, the heavy glass door clicking softly shut behind her. I remained still in the shadows, holding my breath. Eleanor exhaled sharply, a sound of pure exasperation. She reached her hand out, her fingers poised to flick the offending piece of cardboard directly into the sleek metal wastebasket beside her desk. But her hand froze midair. Even from where I stood, I could see what had caught her attention. It wasn't printed text. It wasn't the elegant calligraphy of corporate partners. It was the jagged, uneven scrawl of a red crayon. Eleanor stared at it. The clock on the wall ticked forward, a relentless reminder of the hours slipping away. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the glass, washing Manhattan in an endless sea of gray. Inside, the immense weight of Victor Thorne's impending 3 o'clock meeting hung over the room like an executioner's blade, threatening to gut the foundation of the company. And there, sitting on the edge of the CEO's immaculate desk, was a piece of cheap cardboard written in crayon. Eleanor did not throw it away. Chapter 2. A Crayon Reply and Shadows of Deceit. Eleanor Vance's manicured finger, painted in a flawless shade of nude enamel, hovered above the coarse cardboard resting on her tempered glass desk. The red crayon script was jagged, uneven, and pressed so hard into the material that the waxy residue had clumped in the corners of the letters. It was the handwriting of a child who was just learning how to force the world to understand her. Eleanor pulled the small card closer, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she deciphered the misspelled words. "Dear Lady Boss," the note began. "I am Mia, 6 years old. My dad Arthur told me you let him work extra at night to make the makeup videos." Dad says because of the money from you, he doesn't have to sell our old truck this week, and I got my asthma medicine. I used my allowance to buy these flowers. Thank you for saving me and my dad." There were no polished corporate buzzwords on that piece of cardboard. There was no networking strategy, no sycophantic praise meant to secure a promotion, and no calculated commercial intent. It was simply the raw, unfiltered gratitude of a child breathing easier because her father had traded his sleep for her survival. The profound silence of the 60th floor suddenly felt suffocating. The distant, muted hum of Fifth Avenue traffic below seemed to vanish entirely, leaving Eleanor completely alone with the heavy, rhythmic thud of her own heartbeat. The impenetrable fortress of the Iron Lady fractured in an instant. Unbidden and fiercely sharp, memories clawed their way up from the dark vault where she had buried them decades ago. She wasn't always the CEO of Lumiere. 20 years ago, Eleanor had been a desperate single mother, living in a freezing, drafty studio apartment in Queens. She remembered the bone-deep terror of rocking her own feverish infant daughter in the dead of winter, wrapped in 3 layers of cheap blankets because the heating had been shut off. She remembered the humiliation of counting loose pennies at the bodega counter just to afford formula and generic cough syrup. Back then, an extra shift meant the difference between dignity and despair. Looking at the crayon scrawl, Eleanor realized with a sickening jolt that she had become the very kind of oblivious, towering overlord she had once begged for mercy from. Arthur Hayes wasn't a nameless cog in Victor Thorne's operational budget. He was a father fighting the same brutal war she had fought. Eleanor stood up so abruptly that her heavy leather chair rolled back and slammed into the mahogany credenza. She slammed the heel of her hand onto the intercom button. "Sarah?" Her voice echoed through the speaker, stripped entirely of its usual icy composure. "Bring that bouquet back into this office, immediately." While Eleanor's world was quietly shattering and reshaping itself on the 60th floor, a much darker transaction was taking place 20 blocks south. Inside the dimly lit, mahogany-paneled dining room of Le Chêne, an exclusive French restaurant where the cheapest appetizer cost more than Arthur Hayes made in a week, Victor Thorne sat swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux. The chief operating officer looked entirely in his element, his bespoke charcoal suit absorbing the ambient golden light of the chandeliers. Across the white linen tablecloth sat a man who fundamentally did not belong in such an establishment. Julian Croft was the regional director for Apex Global Solutions, the offshore outsourcing agency Victor was fiercely championing. Julian was in his late 30s, a man whose ambition vastly outpaced his competence. He wore an overly shiny, ill-fitting royal blue suit that strained at the buttons, and he smelled aggressively of cheap drugstore cologne mixed with nervous sweat. Julian had the slippery, overly eager demeanor of a man who made his living selling snake oil to the desperate, his eyes constantly darting around the room as if expecting to be thrown out at any moment. His career had been a series of cut-corner projects and failed ventures until Victor Thorne had mysteriously summoned him to New York. Victor pulled a thick, manila envelope from his leather briefcase and slid it across the table. Julian wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers before eagerly snatching it up. Inside were the internal performance reviews and financial projections for Lumiere's content production team. "These are the finalized quarterly reports, Julian," Victor said, his voice a smooth, venomous purr. "According to these documents, our internal production crew is hemorrhaging capital. The equipment maintenance costs have been inflated by 300%, and their turnaround time has been artificially logged as severely delayed. On paper, they are an absolute financial disaster, a liability that the board cannot possibly justify keeping." Julian grinned, exposing a row of slightly yellowed teeth. He didn't care about the art of cosmetics, the nuance of lighting, or the livelihoods of the men and women being slandered in those pages. He only saw the bottom line. "And our agency's proposal?" Julian asked, his voice reedy and thin. "It looks like a miracle by comparison," Victor replied coolly, taking a slow sip of his wine. "You are offering to do the work for 30% of our current operating cost. Of course, your actual output is generic, uninspired garbage. But by the time the board realizes the drop in quality, the contracts will be signed, and the internal team will be long gone." Julian leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And the consulting fee for your assistance in this transition, Mr. Thorne?" Victor's smile did not reach his cold obsidian eyes. "The 7-figure kickback will be wired to my shell corporation in the Cayman Islands exactly 1 hour after Eleanor signs the termination orders at the 3 o'clock board meeting. The board is already terrified of the fake losses I've presented. Eleanor is too obsessed with the autumn launch to double-check my arithmetic. By 5 o'clock today, Arthur Hayes and every other internal parasite will be standing in the unemployment line, and you will have your contract. Victor raised his wineglass in a mock toast to the pouring rain outside the restaurant window. He had orchestrated the perfect corporate slaughter, entirely unaware that a 6-year-old girl's crayon drawing had just armed the very woman he was trying to manipulate. Chapter 3. The Crystal Vase and the Dark Equipment Room. I watched from my usual discreet vantage point near the mahogany doorway as Sarah practically sprinted back into the corner office, her sensible low-heeled shoes clicking rapidly against the marble. She was clutching the damp, newspaper-wrapped bundle of bruised daisies, as if they were the crown jewels. Eleanor was still standing by her desk, the red crayon cardboard note held delicately between her fingers. The air in the room had shifted. The freezing, high-altitude pressure of the 60th floor had suddenly thawed into something profoundly human. Without a word, Eleanor pointed a manicured finger toward the center of her desk. There, sitting atop a stack of million-dollar budget proposals, was a magnificent baccarat crystal vase. It was a heavy, geometrically cut masterpiece of French artisanship that usually housed $500 imported Phalaenopsis orchids. Eleanor had unceremoniously dumped the pristine white orchids into the wastebasket moments before Sarah's return. "Put them in there," Eleanor instructed, her voice lacking its usual glacial bite. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, but a genuine, radiant smile broke across her usually anxious face. With trembling, careful hands, the young assistant unwrapped the cheap daisies and arranged them within the heavy crystal. They looked utterly absurd, limp, uneven, and slightly browned at the edges. Yet, standing there in the center of corporate power, they possessed a raw, defiant beauty that no imported exotic flower could ever match. Even Duchess, the perpetually unimpressed Persian cat, hopped gracefully onto the desk, sniffed the bruised petals with mild curiosity, and surprisingly, chose to curl up right next to the vase, instead of knocking it over. Eleanor did not sit down. She turned to Sarah, her posture straightening, not with the rigid tension of stress, but with the focused, deadly alignment of a predator finding its true target. "Sarah, listen to me carefully," Eleanor commanded, her tone vibrating with a new, fierce energy. "I want you to pull Arthur Hayes' employment file immediately. He is no longer a temporary contractor. Draft the necessary paperwork to convert him to full-time staff, effective as of this morning. I want him enrolled in the platinum tier of our executive health insurance program. Ensure the plan fully covers dependents, specifically pediatric asthma treatments, with zero copay." Sarah was writing furiously on her legal pad, her hand shaking with pure adrenaline. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, her gaze softening just a fraction as she looked at the crayon note, "contact that luxury boutique in Soho. Have them hand-deliver the most extensive, professional-grade art supply kit they carry to his home address. Address the gift card to Mia." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, whispering a breathless, "Right away, ma'am," before darting out of the office, fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. Eleanor slowly turned her gaze toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the gray rain wash over the city. Then, she noticed me lingering in the doorway. "Wilder," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Walk with me." It was highly unusual for the CEO to leave the executive suite this close to a major board meeting, but I asked no questions. I simply nodded and followed her to the private executive elevator. She pressed the button for sublevel 2, a floor she had not visited in at least 7 years. As the elevator descended, leaving the pristine, beige, and glass world of the upper floors behind, the atmosphere grew heavier. Sublevel 2 was the production basement, the subterranean lungs of Lumiere. When the door slid open, we stepped into a cavernous, dimly lit space that smelled of hot metal, ozone, and stale black coffee. It was a chaotic labyrinth of thick black cables, towering C-stands, and massive aluminum truss structures. Eleanor held up a hand, signaling me to stay quiet, and we stepped into the shadows behind a stack of wooden crates to observe. A few yards away, in the center of a tangled mess of wiring, stood Arthur Hayes. It was the first time I had seen the man up close. Arthur was in his late 30s, a man whose physical presence spoke of quiet, stubborn endurance. He wore a faded, grease-stained flannel shirt, rolled up to his elbows, and a heavy canvas utility belt weighed down his hips. He had broad shoulders that were currently hunched with deep exhaustion, dark hair dusted with drywall powder, and kind, tired hazel eyes. His calloused hands moved over a highly complex, delicate DMX lighting controller circuit board with surprising grace and precision. Working beside him was a man I recognized as Benny, the head rigger. Benny was in his early 60s, built like a concrete fire hydrant, sporting a magnificent, bushy walrus mustache and a faded Lumiere crew t-shirt from a decade ago. Benny was a notoriously grumpy veteran who suffered corporate fools poorly, but right now, he was looking at Arthur with a profound, unspoken respect. "I'm telling you, Artie, this is a total write-off," Benny grumbled, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. He gestured angrily at the massive, scorched lighting rig suspended above them. "Those suited idiots from that offshore agency Thorne brought in last week for the efficiency test? They bypassed the voltage regulators completely. They fried the main circuits just to make their setup time look faster on paper. They have no idea what they're doing. We should just report it and let the autumn launch delay." "It's not your fault." Arthur didn't stop working. He meticulously spliced a tiny blue wire, his jaw set with quiet determination. "We can't let the launch delay, Benny," Arthur replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the chaotic room. "The company's relying on this visual campaign. If the lighting fails, the product looks cheap. We just need to bypass the burnt motherboards and manually sequence the dimmers. I'll pull another double shift tonight if I have to. We're going to fix what they broke." From our hidden vantage point, I saw Eleanor's breath hitch. She stood perfectly still, her eyes tracking every drop of sweat on Arthur's brow, listening to the undeniable truth echoing in the basement. The spreadsheets Victor Thorne had handed her were elaborate, malicious lies. He had claimed the internal team was slow, incompetent, and hemorrhaging money. But right here, in the dim, dusty light of the equipment room, Eleanor saw the exact opposite. She saw an external agency, the very one Victor was championing, causing catastrophic damage through reckless negligence. And she saw her own people like Arthur Hayes, bleeding themselves dry to secretly fix the damage, protecting the company's integrity out of pure, unrewarded dedication. The cold, calculated CEO, who only cared about profit margins, dissolved entirely in the shadows of Sublevel 2. Eleanor Vance realized in that moment that the true heart and soul of her empire did not reside in the immaculate boardrooms or the offshore bank accounts of her executives. The soul of Lumiere was right here, wielding a soldering iron, fighting to keep the lights on. I watched as her pale hands curled into tight fists. The fear of Victor's upcoming 3 o'clock meeting was gone from her eyes, replaced by a terrifying, righteous fury. She didn't need to see anymore. She turned on her heel and marched back toward the elevator, preparing for war. Chapter 4. The Boardroom Confrontation and the House of Cards. The grand boardroom on the 60th floor was a theater designed specifically to make powerful people feel even more powerful and to make everyone else feel incredibly small. At precisely 3 o'clock, the storm outside raged on, casting long, dramatic, watery shadows across the 50-foot solid mahogany table. I stood at my customary post by the heavy oak double doors, my hands clasped firmly behind my back, my face an unreadable mask. Around the table sat the 12 members of the Lumiere Board of Directors. At the head of the table sat Marcus Sterling, the chairman. Marcus was a man of 70, with a shock of thick, silver hair and a posture that remained intimidatingly upright, despite his reliance on a heavy, silver-handled cane. A former hedge fund titan who had survived the crashes of the 80s and 90s, Marcus had a mind like a steel trap for numbers. However, his singular, ruthless focus on profitability often blinded him to the human cost of his decisions. He was a man who preferred reading quarterly earnings reports over literature, and he viewed employees as mere variables in a complex algebraic equation. Today, Marcus was nodding along with the rhythmic, hypnotic cadence of Victor Thorne's voice. Victor stood at the front of the room, illuminated by the cold, blue glow of the massive presentation screen. He was delivering a masterpiece of corporate deception. Slide after slide displayed plunging bar graphs and alarming red numbers, all meticulously fabricated to paint our internal production team as a bloated, incompetent financial sinkhole. "As you can see, gentlemen," Victor purred, his charcoal suit absorbing the projector's light, making him look like a shadow cast against the data. The internal content division is operating at a catastrophic deficit. Equipment maintenance costs are inexplicably soaring, and turnaround times are bleeding into our launch windows. However, by transitioning our production to Apex Global Solutions, we can reduce our overhead by a staggering 35% before the end of the fiscal year. He paused perfectly, letting the promise of fake millions settle like sweet poison in the minds of the board. Marcus Sterling tapped his manicured fingers on the table, his sharp eyes fixed greedily on the screen. These projections are highly compelling, Victor, Marcus rumbled, his voice gravelly and authoritative, echoing in the cavernous room. If these internal costs are truly as bloated as you claim, keeping this team is nothing short of financial malpractice. I believe we are ready to move to a vote. Victor's lips curled into a barely perceptible, predatory smile of victory. He had won, or so he thought. At the opposite end of the long table, Eleanor Vance finally moved. She had sat in absolute, terrifying silence for the past 40 minutes. Her expression, a mask of impenetrable ice, the emerald green fabric of her power suit stark against the dark leather of her executive chair. We will not be voting on this proposal, Marcus, Eleanor said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying gravitational density that instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Every head snapped toward her. Victor's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes narrowing. Eleanor, Victor began, deploying his most condescending, placating tone, the tone one might use to soothe a hysterical child. I understand your emotional attachment to the autumn launch and the people who have worked on it, but the numbers simply do not lie. Eleanor stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate. You are entirely correct, Victor, she replied, her pale blue eyes locking onto his with the lethal intensity of a sniper's scope. The numbers do not lie, but the people who present them certainly do. She turned her piercing gaze to me, standing silently by the doors. Wilder, bring him in. I pulled open the heavy oak doors. Standing in the brightly lit hallway, looking as though he were preparing to face a firing squad, was Arthur Hayes. Beside him stood Sarah, clutching a thick stack of red manila folders tightly to her chest. Sarah's face was flushed, her hair slightly disheveled from spending the last 2 hours frantically digging through encrypted, archived servers. But her hazel eyes blazed with a fierce, unprecedented courage that she had finally found. I ushered them inside. The boardroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Arthur looked entirely alien in this sterile, high-end environment. He was still wearing his faded, grease-stained flannel shirt, his heavy canvas utility belt weighing down his hips, and the faint, acrid smell of ozone and burnt wiring clung to him like cheap cologne. The board members stared at him as if a stray muddy dog had just wandered onto their pristine white carpets. What is the meaning of this? Marcus Sterling demanded, his knuckles turning white as his grip tightened on his silver cane. This is a closed executive session. Who is this man? Eleanor walked slowly around the table, taking the heavy files from Sarah's trembling hands. Marcus, board members, I would like to introduce Arthur Hayes. He is one of our senior lighting technicians. Arthur, please tell the board what you spent the last 14 hours doing in Sublevel 2. Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. The intimidating, collective glare of 12 billionaires was fixed solely on him. It was enough to make any man crumble. But then he looked at Eleanor, remembering the signed full-time contract, the platinum health insurance papers that secured his daughter's asthma medication, and the profound respect she had shown him just an hour ago. He squared his broad, tired shoulders and met Marcus Sterling's gaze. I was rebuilding the main DMX lighting arrays, Arthur stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded surprising, undeniable authority. During the efficiency test last week, the contractors from Apex Global Solutions, the agency Mr. Thorne, is recommending bypass the primary voltage regulators to cut their setup time in half. When they powered on the grid, they fried 3 central motherboards and caused a localized electrical fire that nearly triggered the building's sprinkler system. They hid the damaged, scorched equipment behind the staging flats and left. If we had tried to shoot the autumn campaign tomorrow with their setup, the entire stage would have blown and someone could have been killed. My team and I have been pulling unpaid double shifts in the dark to manually rebuild the circuits from scratch so the company's launch isn't delayed. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the boardroom. Victor Thorne's face instantly drained of color, his perfectly tanned skin turning a sickly, ashen shade of gray. This is absurd, Victor barked, his smooth, polished facade violently cracking. This man is a disgruntled temporary worker, making up wild, slanderous stories to save his obsolete job. Eleanor slammed the stack of red manila folders onto the mahogany table. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. He is not a temporary worker, Victor. He is a full-time employee of Lumiere, and he is telling the exact, verified truth. She signaled to Sarah, who quickly, efficiently, distributed the heavy folders to the shocked board members. Inside these files, which my assistant painstakingly recovered from the archives you attempted to delete, you will find the real operational costs of our internal team, Eleanor announced, her voice ringing with absolute crushing dominance. You will also find the security camera logs and maintenance reports, proving that the Apex agency caused over $200,000 in equipment damage in a single afternoon. Furthermore, on the very last page, you will find a routing record of an offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands, linked directly to a shell corporation owned by you, Victor, which was scheduled to receive a 7-figure kickback deposit from Apex Global Solutions at exactly 4 o'clock today. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. The sound of the rain beating against the glass seemed deafening now. Marcus Sterling opened his folder, his sharp eyes scanning the undeniable, meticulously gathered proof of Victor's fraud and the external agency's catastrophic incompetence. The chairman's face turned a mottled, furious shade of red, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk tie. He slammed the file shut and glared at Victor with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. You manipulated company data to secure a personal bribe while actively sabotaging our most critical marketing campaign? Marcus hissed, his gravelly voice trembling with a terrifying rage. Victor opened his mouth, stammering, his hands shaking as he desperately searched for an excuse, a lie, anything to save himself. But the heavy air in the room had already sealed his fate. He looked frantically at the disgusted board members, then at the grease-stained technician who had exposed his lies, and finally at Eleanor. The Iron Lady stood tall and unyielding, having completely dismantled his intricate, malicious house of cards without breaking a single sweat. The coup was officially over, and Victor Thorne had lost everything. Chapter 5. Meeting the Authentic Pieces. The immediate aftermath of the boardroom confrontation was swift and merciless, a clinical execution of corporate justice. Marcus Sterling, his face still flushed with righteous indignation, did not even allow Victor Thorne to return to his office to collect his personal effects. At Marcus's sharp command, Garrison stepped into the room. Garrison was Lumiere's head of corporate security, a hulking, bald former Marine in his late 40s whose uniform always looked a size too small for his massive muscular frame. He was a man of few words, possessing a stoic, unflappable nature that made him perfectly suited for dealing with volatile executives. Garrison placed a heavy, immovable hand on Victor's shoulder, effectively ending the chief operating officer's reign of terror. Victor was formally suspended pending a full criminal and financial investigation, his security badge confiscated on the spot. As Garrison escorted a pale, trembling Victor out of the boardroom, the suffocating cloud of dread that had hung over the 60th floor for months seemed to follow him out the door. The board quickly voted to unequivocally reject the Apex Global Solutions contract, and Marcus Sterling offered Eleanor a rare, respectful nod before adjourning the session. The battle was won, but Eleanor's work for the day was not yet complete. She turned to me, her posture relaxing just a fraction, and instructed me to escort Arthur Hayes back to her private office. Walking back down the beige, heavily carpeted corridor, Arthur looked entirely like a man walking to the gallows. The adrenaline that had fueled his courageous outburst in the boardroom was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, creeping panic. His grease-stained hands rubbed nervously against the sides of his heavy canvas utility belt, and his breathing was shallow. He was a blue-collar worker who had just publicly humiliated a C-suite executive in front of the board of directors. In his world, that kind of blunt honesty usually resulted in immediate termination, regardless of who was actually right. I guided him into Eleanor's corner office and gently closed the heavy glass door behind him, remaining at my post just inside the room. Eleanor was already seated at her desk. The storm outside was finally beginning to break, and the late afternoon sun was piercing through the gray clouds, casting a warm, golden light across the 60th floor. That golden light caught the edges of the baccarat crystal vase, illuminating the bruised, white daisies that stood proudly at the center of her workspace. "Please, sit down, Mr. Hayes," Eleanor said, gesturing to one of the plush leather chairs opposite her desk. Arthur sank into the chair awkwardly, perched on the very edge, as if ready to bolt. "Miss Vance," Arthur started, his voice a nervous, rumbling stumble. "Look, I know I was out of line in there. I spoke out of turn. I couldn't let them blame my crew for what those outside guys did. If you need my badge, I understand. Just please don't penalize the rest of the boys downstairs. They worked themselves to the bone for this company." Eleanor held up a hand, silencing him not with harshness, but with a surprising, quiet warmth. She opened a sleek leather folder on her desk and slid 2 crisp documents across the glass surface toward him. Arthur stared at them, confused. "I am not asking for your badge, Arthur," Eleanor said, her pale blue eyes softening into an expression I had not seen on her face in over a decade. "I am asking for your signature." The first document is a formal contract finalizing your transition from a temporary contractor to a full-time senior lighting technician. Your salary has been adjusted to reflect your actual value to this company, which is considerable. Arthur blinked, his jaw dropping slightly as he read the numbers on the page. Before he could process the shock, Eleanor tapped the second document. The second form is your enrollment in Lumiere's Platinum Executive Health Insurance tier. I have personally authorized a policy override to ensure it covers all dependents with 0 out-of-pocket costs. She paused, her gaze shifting briefly to the red crayon note resting beside the crystal vase. "I understand your daughter, Mia, requires specialized asthma medication. This policy will ensure you never have to choose between her health and your livelihood again. There is also a package of professional art supplies currently en route to your apartment. Consider it a small token of my appreciation for her artwork." Arthur stared at the papers, his rough hands trembling uncontrollably. Tears welled up in his tired hazel eyes, and he hastily wiped them away with the back of his flannel sleeve. He tried to speak, but the crushing weight of sudden, unexpected salvation had stolen his voice. "You don't need to apologize for telling the truth, Arthur," Eleanor continued softly, leaning forward. "For a long time, I let this company be run by spreadsheets and profit margins, forgetting the people who actually build our success. I owe you a profound apology. You didn't just save my autumn launch today. You and your daughter reminded me why I fought so hard to build this empire in the first place. Thank you for the flowers. They are, without a doubt, the most valuable thing on my desk." Arthur finally looked up, offering a tearful, blindingly bright smile, and simply whispered, "Thank you, ma'am." Meanwhile, beyond the heavy glass doors of the corner office, a seismic shift was rolling through the entire Lumiere building. Sarah, operating with unprecedented speed and a massive, triumphant grin, had drafted and dispatched the company-wide memo announcing the board's decision. The news spread like wildfire. Down in sublevel 2, I later learned, the reaction was explosive. Benny, the grumpy veteran rigger with the walrus mustache, actually wept and hugged a junior grip, while the rest of the production crew erupted into deafening cheers. For months, they had worked under the suffocating, toxic threat of Victor Thorne's restructuring plan, waiting for the axe to fall. They had believed their CEO was just another cold, untouchable oligarch who viewed them as expendable numbers. But the memo changed everything. It detailed not only the cancellation of the offshore outsourcing, but also implemented new, immediate protections for the internal creative teams. The atmosphere of Lumiere transformed within a single hour. The paralyzing fear that had gripped the cubicles and studios dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming surge of loyalty, relief, and passionate enthusiasm. People were smiling in the hallways. The creative teams were practically buzzing with a renewed, fierce dedication to the upcoming autumn launch. They realized that the Iron Lady was not just a ruthless businesswoman, she was a formidable shield. Eleanor Vance had stepped out of her ivory tower, looked into the dark, dusty corners of her empire, and chosen to protect her people over a falsely inflated bottom line. As I stood in the corner office, watching Arthur sign his new life into existence, I realized that Lumiere was no longer just a corporate machine running on fear and efficiency. It had finally become a home. Chapter 6. The True Light of Lumiere. 2 months later, the world outside the 60th floor had transitioned from the weeping gray of late summer to the crisp, brilliant gold of autumn, and the atmosphere within the walls of Lumiere had undergone an equally profound transformation. The highly anticipated Autumn Cosmetics campaign launched globally on YouTube, and it did not merely succeed, it became an absolute cultural phenomenon. The beauty community and industry critics alike were captivated, not just by the vibrant pigments of the makeup, but by the breathtaking visual quality of the videos. The lighting, meticulously designed, manually wired, and fiercely protected by Arthur Hayes and his dedicated Sub-Level 2 crew, was universally praised. It possessed a warm, cinematic authenticity that made the models look ethereal, yet wonderfully human, a stark departure from the sterile, over-processed, commercial glare of our competitors. Within the first 48 hours, the campaign shattered every engagement metric in the company's history, driving a record-breaking surge in revenue that left the board of directors utterly speechless. The financial victory, however, was secondary to the cultural renaissance that had blossomed within the company. The toxic, suffocating fog of fear that had once paralyzed the cubicles was completely eradicated, replaced by a vibrant, collaborative energy. For the first time in years, the employees of Lumiere did not view their executive leadership as a distant, tyrannical force, but as a genuine guardian of their creative integrity. To commemorate this historic triumph, Eleanor hosted a lavish celebration party, not in some exclusive off-site VIP club, but right here in the grand atrium of the Lumiere building, ensuring that every single employee, from the executive vice presidents to the junior grips, could attend. I stood by the grand marble staircase, nursing a glass of sparkling water, quietly observing the joyous chaos. The atrium was draped in elegant autumnal florals, echoing the aesthetic of the campaign, and a live jazz quartet played an upbeat melody in the corner. I spotted Sarah near the catering tables, looking entirely transformed. The timid, trembling assistant, who used to hide inside oversized, oatmeal-colored cardigans, was gone. Tonight, Sarah wore a sharply tailored, plum-colored cocktail dress, her posture upright and confident, laughing freely as she chatted with Benny, the veteran rigger, who was enthusiastically devouring a plate of imported caviar while wearing his best, surprisingly clean flannel shirt. The crowd naturally parted as Eleanor Vance descended the marble staircase. The Iron Lady had altered her armor. Instead of the severe, intimidating emerald or charcoal suits, she wore a beautifully cut, soft cream blazer over a silk blouse, her ash blonde hair styled in loose, approachable waves rather than the usual painfully tight chignon. Her pale blue eyes, once cold and calculating, now radiated a genuine, relaxed warmth. She moved through the room not as an untouchable monarch, but as a respected captain among her crew, stopping to personally thank the marketing coordinators, the set designers, and the technicians. Just as Eleanor reached the center of the atrium, the heavy glass doors at the entrance swung open. I watched Arthur Hayes step inside. He looked distinctly out of his element, but undeniably proud, dressed in a modest but perfectly pressed navy suit, a far cry from the drywall-dusted canvas belt he usually wore. But it was the small figure clutching his hand that commanded the room's attention. This was Mia. The 6-year-old girl was a portrait of vibrant, restored health, her bright hazel eyes, the exact same shade as her father's, wide with absolute wonder as she took in the sparkling chandeliers and towering floral arrangements. Thanks to the platinum health insurance policy, the terrifying wheeze that had once plagued her breathing was entirely gone, leaving her with a rosy, energetic complexion. She wore a pristine, pale yellow party dress adorned with a white ribbon at the waist, her dark hair braided neatly down her back. In her free hand, she tightly clutched a large, spiral-bound sketchbook. Arthur gently nudged his daughter forward, offering her a reassuring smile. Mia took a deep breath, her tiny black patent leather shoes clicking softly against the marble floor as she bravely navigated the sea of towering adults. She walked straight up to Eleanor Vance, who immediately stopped her conversation with a senior VP and knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with the child. The towering CEO and the 6-year-old girl regarded each other in a pocket of quiet intimacy amidst the loud party. "Hello, Mia," Eleanor said, her voice incredibly soft, carrying a maternal tenderness I had never heard before. "I am so incredibly happy you could come to our party tonight. You look absolutely beautiful." Mia blushed, a shy but brilliant smile illuminating her face. She held out the sketchbook, flipping it open to a freshly drawn page. "I brought you a new picture, Lady Boss," Mia piped up, her voice clear and sweet. "Dad bought me the best crayons ever. Thank you." Eleanor took the sketchbook with both hands, treating it with the reverence one might reserve for a priceless historical manuscript. I stepped slightly closer to see the artwork. It was a masterpiece of childhood imagination, vastly more detailed than the hasty note written on cardboard 2 months ago. Mia had drawn a magnificent, towering field of bright white daisies under a vibrant blue sky. Standing right in the center of the flowers was a figure wearing a sharp, recognizable green business suit, but with a pair of massive, sparkling fairy wings sprouting from her back and a golden wand in her hand. It was an executive fairy godmother. Eleanor traced the outline of the crayon wings with her thumb. A single, silent tear escaped her eye, catching the light of the chandeliers before she quickly blinked it away, replacing it with a smile so radiant and profoundly joyful that it seemed to light up the entire atrium. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, Mia," Eleanor whispered, pulling the little girl into a gentle, heartfelt embrace. Arthur watched from a few feet away, his own eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. The next morning, long after the party had ended and the confetti had been swept away, I entered the corner office on the 60th floor to leave the daily schedule on the desk. Duchess, the Persian cat, was fast asleep in her velvet bed, purring softly. The office was quiet, bathed in the clean, bright morning sunlight. Right in the center of the mahogany credenza, permanently replacing the expensive orchids, sat the baccarat crystal vase, newly filled with a fresh, vibrant bouquet of white daisies that Arthur now delivered every single Monday. And hanging on the wall directly beside it, professionally mounted in a custom-made silver frame, was the crayon drawing of the corporate fairy. I smiled as I turned to leave. Lumiere had fiercely maintained its throne at the absolute pinnacle of the market, its financial empire more secure than ever. But looking at that crayon drawing, I knew that Eleanor Vance had finally learned the most crucial business lesson of her entire life. She had realized that the greatest, most enduring profit a leader could ever generate did not exist on a sterile spreadsheet or an offshore bank account. The true wealth of an empire lay in the quiet, profound act of changing the lives of the everyday people who bled, sweat, and worked in the shadows to build it. The beautiful lesson of this story is that true wealth is not measured by the numbers in a bank account or the height of a skyscraper. It is found in the way we treat the people around us, especially those who work quietly in the shadows. Eleanor realized that her empire was built on the sweat and dedication of ordinary, hardworking people. In our daily lives, it is so easy to get caught up in the rush of work, paying bills, and chasing personal ambitions. We sometimes put on our own armor to survive the day and forget to see the humanity in others. But this story gently reminds us to pause and appreciate the people who make our lives easier. Whether it is a delivery driver, a cleaner, or a tired parent trying to provide for their child, everyone is fighting a battle we know nothing about. A simple thank you or a small act of grace can be the light that heals wounds we cannot even see. If this story brought a little warmth to your day, please share it with your friends and family to spread the message. Leave a comment below to let me know your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing these beautiful journeys together. May God bless you and your loved ones with endless peace, health, and a heart full of compassion.
Fresh coffee.
If you believe that a
thank
small
you
act of
so
kindness
much.
can truly
That
change
is
a
very
person's
kind of
whole
you.
world, please type Amen in the comments below.